Thank you for including me in this, because Washington State, and particularly Thurston County, has a long, rich history of powerhouse women. There are so many points on the curve that illustrate this, so I want to share a few with you. And in a moment, you're going to hear from our chief historian in Washington, in the Secretary of State's office, John Hughes, who's going to share some really good perspective on today's events. Washington men really backed women getting the right to vote. In fact, if you go back to 1854, Seattle pioneer Arthur Denny proposed in the Territorial Assembly that all white females over the age of 18 should have the right to vote. That's how progressive and ahead of the curve we were here in Washington, including the men. In 1883, women had the right to vote, and the Territorial Supreme Court in 1887 said, they made a mistake. They didn't mean for women to have the right to vote.
And with a very quick stroke of the pen, all they did is they wrote in the word male in their decision, that only males could have the right to vote in the Washington Territory. And I think it was Chief Justice Alexander who said that was judicial jujitsu. That, of course, just one stroke of the pen changed everything.
But I think one thing we can be really proud of here in Washington State is that the men in our state legislature in 1910 kind of got it, and the voters certainly got it with a constitutional amendment giving the women the right to vote in 1910. And Shauna Stevenson points out that we are credited as a state for re-energizing the women's suffrage movement, that it really jump-started it. And it still took 10 years to pass the 19th Amendment, but she credits, and many historians credit Washington's, 1910 being the fifth state to give women the right to vote as the thing that turned the tide and really got the momentum going. So here in Littlerock, we should be really proud of those courageous women who really changed things before all of that happened that I just talked about. Finally, I just have to share with you a fun story because many people haven't heard it. August 18th, as most of you probably know, is the day that the Tennessee legislature ratified the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. And it came down to a single vote by a young man named Harry T. Byrne. Now, Harry, if you know anything about the final days of the women's suffrage movement, it came down to Tennessee, and their Senate had voted to ratify the amendment, but their House was in a deadlock tie. In fact, they had a motion on the floor to table the amendment entirely, and it locked up in a 48-48 tie. And the way that they told how people were going to vote on the floor is the men wore a red rose on their lapel if they were against women's suffrage, and they wore a yellow rose on their lapel if they were for it. And Harry T. Byrne had a red rose on his lapel. So the motion was tabled. The motion to table was not passed, so they had to take a vote. They began doing the roll call. Harry Byrne was holding in one hand a letter from his mom that basically said, "You should vote for this, sweetie. I am your mother, and I'd like to vote." And on the other side, he had his lapel. And so they called his name, and he said, "I." And it was so shocking that they actually went to the next vote before anyone realized that at that moment, the 19th Amendment was passed. Of course, it was a huge uproar. The motion passed, and he got off the floor as quickly as possible. And all the reporters tried to track him down, and they finally did the next day. And he explained on the floor of the House that he thought it was better to follow the advice of his mother as a boy than it would be to concur her wrath. So that is in part why women today have the right to vote. And we're thankful for all of the women who fought so hard, like these powerhouse women here in Littlerock. And we're also thankful for all of the men who supported that effort as well. So with that, I hope that all of you are proud of what we're going to dedicate today. Thank you again for allowing me to be part of this wonderful celebration. And thank you to the Daughters of the Colonists for all this work, because this is important to mark our history, and you've done a great job of it here today. Thank you.